So, before proposing some comments on this very rich and innovative contribution, let me require your indulgence. You might have expected a more competent answer. A geographer was on the agenda. He could not be here. I am only a surrogate. I hope you will admit that Michel ESPAGNE's paper is more concerned with what we call in France géographie humaine than in geological geography. And also that his paper is not deprived of some ethnological concern, which are my excuse. There, I am a bit more comfortable. So, the invitation to replace our colleague has been for me largely rewarding, taking account of the importance, both methodological and factual, of Michel ESPAGNE's paper. I read it as an effective and detailed and deep manifesto on what is an approach in the perspective of cultural transfers and what decisive modification it induces. To put it in a nutshell, his communication has been a going-on contraposition to some awaited points of view. As a first illustration, I quote that instead of sticking to the rather obscure notion of barbarians, Michel ESPAGNE avoids it and gives proper names. Barbarian, I don't know. There are Huns, Mongols, Turks, just to quote some eminent ones. Second, Michel ESPAGNE does not stick to the classical antiquity to consider, it was just mentioned at the beginning, to consider a more encompassing period which includes such dimensions from the Iron era to the end of the Ming dynasty and, as he mentioned, quoting modern Russian historian, modern history. The reason is, as far as I understand it, that the kind of phenomena which are concerned with cultural transfer pertain to a long, very long historical period, then don't come to the eye suddenly, historical period, and to borrow a term from Fernand Braudel, something like a long history, even it was not an historical expose we had. Another difference was to note from the start that the ignorance of the barbarian is not the fact that they are barbarian and we cannot know them. It is our own responsibility, a mix of denegation, prejudice, and a capacity to analyze the documentation. In fact, along the paper of Michel ESPAGNE, it is evident that the barbarians did disappear. So now I shall focus my remarks following the expose of Michel along two moments. First, the question of ignorance, and then the question of enlightenment, which began with those German experts, German learned people, linguists, who went toward Asia. But first, yes, the barbarians were ignored as noted by Michel, taking two very famous examples, Ovid and Augustine. Maybe there is much more to tell about that. Of course, Ovid ignore the people where he is, but because he is threatened by the possibility to lose his own language, to lose his own and to speak that kind of language, which would be neither there nor his one, something of a mixed. So I don't wish to know them because maybe they will invite my mouth. I remember the first line in the Wittgenstein philosophical investigation, noting that learning a language is to turn as mouth, edomito ore. He quotes Augustine, and he finished on that formula of Augustine. When I was a boy and I learned to speak, I had to, which is both turning my mouth and turning my face. Edomito ore. So I will lose my face if I change my language. So it was a great threat. As to Augustine, it is a bit more intricate. Yes, we don't know what was his first language. I consulted many of my Latin colleagues at École Normale. Nobody could tell me it was barbarian, maybe, quite surely, or a Punic language, we don't know. And we have only the perfect Augustinian Latin and language, which is a real marvel, of course, but which he learned in the famous Stoic schools of Carthage, Milan, and Rome. And why we know nothing about his first language? Not only as for Ovid to threatening to coming back to disavoid language, but because after the loss of innocence, he could not speak as his son, Alypius. He could not have the vision of Monica, so better to learn the language of God. So there is always a strategy, intelligent strategy, I confess, a very clever strategy to avoid the language. It is not mere ignorance. And with the fear for Augustine, as we know, that indulge in those African languages, maybe it would be a moral defection, or it may be a kind of Arianism or another sectarism. And so there is always a research of a kind of perfect syntax, if ever it exists, but a perfect language. According to Michel remarks concerning the Tang dynasty, at the moment when the line was clearly marked between barbarians and those who are educated to the classical Chinese classic, I note a kind of correspondence. It is just an hypothesis with what I noted earlier, and that canonical texts are also not only canonical by their content, but also canonical by the kind of syntax and the kind of rationality they did induce. The way we turn our mouth to tell it as Augustine and Wittgenstein. now the turning point, as has been noted by Michel ESPAGNE, is a moment when not only some travelers, very clever indeed, came back with notes on those people they met, but a systematic inquiry was dedicated to those Asian and Middle Asian people, beginning with the most famous curiosity or interest of Catherine of Russia, who used the linguistic competence of German linguists to satisfy interest and political, of course, political, intellectual and political interest. So, by the way, it was connected with the Enlightenment. And as you have heard, those linguists not only came back with documents which has been classified as archive for the government, but also published some text and very interesting notes on languages and also on the way people live. We should say now material culture. And I feel very near to Michel when he included to that move the first interest of Boas, who began his career of grammarian and ethnologist with the Inuit in the north of Europa, and then came to the state and explore the northeast coast near to the Great Lakes and constitute magnificent collections which then have been in the Museum of Natural History in New York. And when, at the moment when he could add arguments to expulse physical anthropology and to really fund an human anthropology or social, as you wish, anthropology. So that Enlightenment was turning point. And my second and last remark concerns what are we waiting from Enlightenment? To be short, I take my argument from a short text written lately by Kant, Anthropology from a Pragmatical Point of View, and I guess that I know to argue the fact that if you wish a great mind of the Enlightenment, please, you have to be interested with Kant. So I come to that text. In a way, a marvel and very enigmatic, in fact. Kant begins by praising Königsberg, where he lives, that small town on the Tegel, and a river which comes to the Baltic Sea, and tells, well, it is perfect. Everything comes, goods, books, stories, and it was at the time when he was also writing his teaching and writing his popular lessons of geography and lessons of anthropology. This marvelous, everything comes here. And if you wish to have a good moment, please read his lesson of geography, where you see Kant absolutely fascinated by the way the elephants live. You have some stories very, very a bit naive and very, he knows everything. He reads the books. Huh? And so Tegel is enough. It's a kind of completeness. In the same book, Anthropology from a Practical Point of View, some pages after, Kant explains how a young boy learns to speak. First, he has no the use of personal pronouns. He says, Peter is playing, Peter is so and so. And then suddenly, both he acquire the first person, I, and the third person, distinction. I don't wish to enter into the detail, it's not the moment here, but it is the moment when the young boy has acquired a transcendental subjectivity. A subjectivity from which I have all the rules of experience, I can speak of everything around me in the world. Because latent are the categories of pure reason and so on, the whole apparatus of Kant's discourse. And so you have that moment which appears at the moment which is called the rational age, the age of reason. And we must connect that notion of, well, I can't, when I walk in Königsberg, I have the whole world at my disposition and the apparatus of transcendental subjectivity. So we have here just a new formula of what the French historian and specialist of Augustine, really a very remarkable man and great production, Gerfagnon, attributes to the Roman emperor, ubi sum mundus est. Where I am, here is the world. Yes, the totality of my experience is satisfied. So we are a repetition of what I tried to note before with another question. Let us go a bit further in Kant and consider the two aspects of his own enlightenment. And sure, my position is not at all to criticize or to criticize enlightenment in general as has been the use. It came in his time, and it was well. Two aspects. If now we come back from those passages in the anthropology or the geography, it is easy to read that, to the constitution of the critique of pure reason. And you know that Kant, having finished, took time to have a popular teaching on the under the notions of anthropology and geography. There are two doctrines in the critique of judgment: the completeness of the table of judgment, the completeness of the human knowledge, which, by the way, it is also a critique of everything else. You must, but because it is not just a pretension, it is because there is a real logical completeness, a marvelous system indeed. And so my question now is thus to conclude, is that kind of completeness connected with ubi sum mundus est, my position as a transcendental subject may satisfy us, and why? I guess that the whole presentation of Michel was a contraposition to that attitude. But just to conclude, I wish to confirm that line of argumentation, quoting a recurring attitude or formula by Lévi-Strauss. You may find an expression of it at the end of Triste Tropique, Le Retour, the way back to France after the war, after the disaster of Europe, after having an ethnological experience where we have two evidences. One which is insisted by Lévi-Strauss. Under the French formula, I cannot translate. Se déprendre de soi, to free oneself of himself and of the transcendental subject. And another consequence, which Lévi-Strauss gives under another guise. The Kantian system is centripète. What we need now is a way of thinking centrifuge. There is so much to be learned, so much difference. And I guess that I shall not offense Michel if I compare the tentative of or the experience of transfer culturel as a near appreciation and effectuation of those two Lévi-Strauss imperatives. Let us be centrifuge and always incomplete. And we have learned of not only today, but some experience which has been led along transfer culturel, along with Lévi-Strauss' wording that we are part of an experimental humanity which has the responsibility of its transformations, of its exchanges, and no guarantee. To you. C'est dommage. It was not the expected result. Question to Michel.
Well, I suppose there was in the mid-20th century a Russian scholar who commented that Russia is the legacy of Genghis Khan, that the empire, the Russian Empire, is actually a reconstituted golden horde, if you like. The constituent elements of the Russian Empire corresponds to, roughly, the golden horde, and of course Lev Gumiliev was part of that wave of scholars of the time who tried to argue for this new Eurasianism, which wasn't too popular with the Soviet authorities, but that he tried to push. I suppose there has been a book by, I think her name is Laruelle. I've forgotten her first name, but she points out that Russian Eurasianism also has its agenda. In other words, the reconstitution of the Russian dominance over former territories that had been controlled by Russia. I suppose the difficulty or the maybe even the duty of us as scholars who engage in Eurasian studies is to divorce our concept of Eurasia from that kind of territorial Eurasianism that is being forwarded by certain Russian scholars of today. So, would you say that, I mean, Lev Gumiliev, what is your opinion of Lev Gumiliev as in that debate of was he more of a Russian Eurasianist, or was he a scholarly Eurasianist? What would be your opinion on how he should be remembered?
It's very difficult to define exactly what is Eurasianism. There is obviously a tendency to consider Russia as a center of the world, or a center. A tendency to consider Russia as the center of the world, but I think there is another dimension. If you begin with the 18th century, the German Empress Catherine II had to help constructing a new Russian identity and to find the basis of the new Russian identity. She wanted to include all the population of the periphery and consider that Russia was Russian was not a race, but it was a sort of commonwealth of all the people which had to be observed and analyzed. And for this purpose, she sent to Siberia and to Caucasus German scholars belonging to the best universities of the times and who are the embodiment of enlightenment. And these people founded a new science, a new discipline, and it was ethnology. And I think it's a step, a new step in the direction of the reformulation of the question of barbarians, because the barbarians were people who had to be put aside, who had to keep quiet beyond the Great Wall, beyond the limes. But after the new idea of Catherine and of the Russian Academy of Sciences, which had been founded by Leibniz, it is necessary to remind that it has been founded by Leibniz. And from this moment, there was a new tendency to seek the content of all the populations, of all these peoples who are just threatening danger, and who became a field of inquiry. And the scholars had to write and to gather dictionaries and to understand how they behave in all their life and to understand these societies. And I think it's very interesting. And if we try to connect Chinese history with European history, we have a good basis with the work of these ethnologists. Because when you observe the map of the world between Europe and China, you have an empty space, more or less. And this empty space is just a space which was occupied by the so-called barbarians. And to define the barbarians is to connect exactly Asia with Europe. But I agree with you, there is a danger in the theory of Eurasianism. There's a positive dimension and other dimensions.
I am going to ask something to Claude about Augustine. I am very interested about what you said, and perhaps would it be necessary to add his silence about his exact knowledge of Greek. Yes. And it is probable that he knew very little Greek, while his master Ambrosius was a perfect Hellenist who read Philo. And one individual decision about language can have huge consequences, because Augustine became the symbol of a Western church which didn't need the help of Greek language and Greek theology.
You're absolutely right. I have nothing to add. In a way, it created a marvelous Latin prose. Just to agree with what Carlos Levy told, of course, Augustine created or contributed to huge development of Latin prose, but in a way, no less, of course, that huge development of the Roman side intensified the rupture with the Greek tradition. No, you're absolutely right. Yes, yes. Thank you so much for the note. And so today we put the finger on the problem that beside, to tell it in Stoic words, there is prophorikos logos, but the question is in the thetos logos. Yeah. Thank you.